Now, there are two stations in London called Hayes, one in the southeast and one in the west. This is the one on the Elizabeth line, Hayes and Harlington. As such, it is Purple Hayes. But the history of this station predates the Elizabeth line by a long shot. Hayes and Harlington is on the Great Western Main Line. The Great Western Railway was a company founded to connect the port of Bristol with the capital city of London. It became clear early on that the railways were going to reshape Britain. If your city didn't have a rail connection, business would bypass it. Bristol was a major port in the early 19th century, and the merchants of the city didn't want to be overtaken by Liverpool. They formed the Great Western Railway in 1833. An Act of Parliament authorised it in 1835. Hayes and Harlington is on the first section of the GWR to open, which went from Paddington to the station now known as Taplow. That section was completed in 1838. But back then there was no station here. Why? Well, as I say, the priority was getting from London to Bristol. In the 1830s, commuting wasn't really a thing. You just lived near to where you worked. It wasn't until the 1860s that commuting really started to take off as a concept. So for the first 20 or so years, trains thundered through the site of what would be Hayes and Harlington without a thought. The line was designed by Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who built it to the unusual gauge of 7 feet and 1/4 inch, as opposed to the standard 4 feet 8.5 inches. His reasoning was, in many ways, sound. His broad gauge enabled locomotives to be stronger, faster and more stable, and coaches and wagons to have a higher capacity. In most ways it made sense, and the GWR was hardly the only railway to deviate from the standard gauge back then. But problems would arise down the line, so to speak. The standard gauge had one major advantage over broad gauge. It was the standard. You could send a train anywhere in the country over any company's track, as long as that railway used the standard gauge. It soon became clear that the only companies that would adopt Brunel's gauge were those that had employed Brunel. The need to offload wherever the GWR met another railway was an enormous hassle, and in 1846, the Regulating the Gauge of Railways Act dictated that no more railways in Britain could be built to broad gauge. The GWR and other Brunel-designed railways began to convert for fear of being left behind, with the last of the GWR's broad gauge track disappearing in 1892. In the 19th century, the railways coexisted with the canals, not always peacefully. In the early days, the canals had far more reach than the railways, even if the puff-puffs had the advantage of speed. At Hayes, the railway came close to the Grand Union Canal, and so a set of sidings were built for transfer of cargo. In 1864, the GWR figured that maybe there was money in this commuting thing, and so they opened a station here. Back then it was just called Hayes. A carriage shed and goods yard were added, next to the bay platform here. The original station building doesn't survive, but it looked rather similar to the one at Southall that does survive. In 1883 it became an underground station. Well, sort of. Between March 1883 and September 1885 inclusive, the District Railway ran a service from Mansion House to Windsor via Ealing, and Hayes was one of the stations on their route. Industries started to spring up around the railway, and these too got their own sidings. Nestlé, EMI, the British Electric Transformer Company, and a creosoting works were among the businesses based here. In fact, the arrival of industry in the late 19th and early 20th century happened so fast that the station was unable to cope with the sudden influx of passengers. The number of services rapidly increased, with many terminating here. In 1897 the station was renamed to Hayes and Harlington, reflecting the proximity of the village of Harlington. It seems that the station was commonly known as Hayes for quite some time after. In 1935 it became the subject of the world's first film in stereo sound. Simply titled Trains at Hayes, remember what I said about the name hanging around, it was shot from the roof of the EMI factory. It gives you a pretty good idea of how different the area looked even then. You can see the extensive goods sidings, and beyond the track it's all fields. I'd show you a proper clip, but Universal Music Group are absolute devils for copyright strikes. In 1948, the Great Western Railway ceased to exist. The railways of Britain were nationalised, and now Hayes and Harlington would come under the control of the Western region of British Railways. Really, it was the post-war arrival of Heathrow Airport that changed the character of the locality, with new developments springing up around it. Soon it felt, for better or for worse, like a true suburb. In the 1960s, change came to Hayes and Harlington. The station had been fairly neglected over the last few decades, and the station building was distinctly shabby. In 1962 it was demolished and replaced with this thing. Did this style of architecture ever look good? Was there ever a time when people looked at these bare minimum buildings and thought, yes, this is it? Bizarre. The rise of road transport meant that industries began to relocate. By the mid-60s, there wasn't enough freight coming in to justify the goods yard, and so in 1967, the yard closed. The signal box serving it went the following year. Commuter trains continued to serve the station, and electrification came in 1995. In 1998, just west of the station, a new junction was opened for the Heathrow Express. This doesn't stop at Hayes and Harlington, what with it being an express and all, but it's fairly notable, I think. In 2005, a stopping service known as Heathrow Connect was begun, which did stop at Hayes and Harlington and served the airport. This was rather handy if you wanted to get to the airport without going into London and then back out again, which was everyone in West London. In 2022, Heathrow Connect would be replaced with the Elizabeth line. In preparation for the introduction of this service, Hayes and Harlington would be rebuilt once again with a larger area and generally nicer building. And if you're one of those people who insists that the Elizabeth line counts as an underground line, you can say that underground trains were reintroduced after nearly 140 years. It also sees a pretty decent bus service. In 2019, the X140 express bus service was introduced, and in 2023 this was rebranded to the SL9 route of the Superloop. There's no denying that Hayes and Harlington has changed a lot over the years. Actually, about the only features that a Great Western Railway passenger would recognise are this canopy and waiting room. Still, given how busy it is today, I think it's safe to say that the GWR made the right call in finally building it. Well, I hope you enjoyed today's video. If so, please do leave a like and perhaps subscribe for more. I would like as ever to thank my donors on Ko-fi, on Patreon, and here on YouTube for your support. You are the Harlington to my Hayes. And I'll see you all again very soon. Cheerio.